Houston's Fifth Ward in the 1940s and 1950s was not a neighborhood that produced country music stars. It produced factory workers and musicians of a different kind. It was, in that era, one of Houston's predominantly black neighborhoods, a community with its own cultural life and its own music, which was the blues and R&B that had been developing in that part of Texas for decades. The neighborhood that Kenny Rogers grew up in was adjacent to that world, touching it without being wholly inside it. And the cultural proximity was something that would eventually show up in his music in ways that the Nashville country establishment didn't always know what to make of. Edward Kenneth Rogers was born on August 21, 1938, in Houston, Texas. He was the fourth of 8 children in a family that was, by any contemporary measure, poor in the direct sense of not having enough money. Not poor in the abstract sense that public figures sometimes employ to indicate a modest upbringing that was actually more comfortable than the word implies, but poor in the concrete sense of a family of 10 people crowded into inadequate housing in a neighborhood that did not have the resources to make the difficulty less difficult. His father, Edward Floyd Rogers, worked as a carpenter when work was available. His mother, Lucille, managed the household. The family moved multiple times within the Houston area as circumstances required, a pattern that is common in the biography of large families of limited means, where the logic of the move is usually the same: a cheaper arrangement in a different part of the same city, a temporary accommodation for a chronic problem. The music in the Rogers household was eclectic in the way that music in Texas households in the 1940s and 1950s often was. Country music from the radio, gospel music from the church, and the blues and R&B that came through the walls from neighbors and from the neighborhood itself. Kenny Rogers would later describe his musical formation as shaped by this eclecticism, as having absorbed, before he had any formal framework for thinking about genre, a range of musical influences that weren't organized the way the industry would later try to organize them. He heard what was available. What was available was everything. The Fifth Ward and the Houston years are present in the music he later made, in ways that are audible if you know what to listen for. The warmth in his voice, the specific quality of emotional directness that distinguished his performances from the more technically polished country singers of his era, has the texture of someone who grew up in a household where a range of musical emotions were expressed without the mediation of genre convention. The blues was in there. The gospel was in there. The country of the Texas radio was in there. None of it was pure, and the impurity was the point. By the late 1950s, he was working with the Bobby Doyle Three, performing jazz in Houston's club circuit, a context that had nothing to do with what he would eventually become famous for, but that taught him something that no other environment could have taught in quite the same way: how to perform for an audience that was not already predisposed to receive you, how to read the temperature of a room and adjust what you were doing in response, how to make a connection across the space between a performer and a crowd that required no prior relationship between them. These were skills. They would transfer. The jazz circuit in Houston in the late 1950s was a working environment for professional musicians, not a training ground for country superstars. But the training was there, in the specific form that all real training takes: the daily practice of doing something difficult in front of people who would tell you, through their attention or their indifference, whether you were doing it right. He began playing guitar as a teenager, partly because an older brother played, and partly because the guitar was one of the few instruments that a family without money could realistically acquire and develop a relationship with. He formed his first band in high school, a group called The Scholars, which performed at school events and local dances, and the modest circuit of teenage venues that Houston's high school social world produced in the mid-1950s. The Scholars were not a professional operation. They were a group of young men learning what music could do in a room full of people, developing the skill and the instinct that live performance develops through the irreplaceable method of repeated exposure to the consequences of doing it. The decision to pursue music professionally was not, in the Rogers family context, an obvious one. The family needed everyone to contribute what they could, and a professional music career was, in 1955 or 1956, a genuinely uncertain proposition, especially for a young white man from a working-class Houston neighborhood whose musical influences ran from country radio to blues and gospel. There was no established path that his specific combination of background and influences pointed toward. What he had was the guitar, the voice, and the specific quality of attention that the young performers who eventually build careers tend to have in common. An ability to read a room, to feel what a room needs, to understand intuitively what the relationship between a performer and an audience requires to be real. He enrolled at the University of Houston briefly, but did not complete his degree. The music was already pulling. By the late 1950s, he was performing professionally, first with the Houston band, the Bobby Doyle Three, which played jazz standards and contemporary popular music in a style that had nothing to do with country music, and that would, if you encountered it now in the biography of Kenny Rogers, seem like it belonged to a different person's story. But it was the same person, at an earlier stage, a musician developing his craft in the specific direction that the available work pointed, not yet knowing what direction the career would eventually take. When The Gambler reached #1 in 1978 and began the period of his maximum commercial dominance, Kenny Rogers was 40 years old. He had been a professional musician for more than 2 decades. He had been in a psychedelic rock band. He had been in a jazz group. He had played folk music and country music and pop music in combinations that made sense at the time and that, in retrospect, made sense as the preparation for an artist who would eventually perform in all of those modes in front of the same audience. The Fifth Ward was behind all of it, not as an abstraction, not as a biographical footnote, but as the specific environment in which the specific person who would become Kenny Rogers acquired the specific qualities that his music required. The poverty that was not chosen, the eclecticism that was not theorized, the early performing experience that was not planned as career development. The family of 10 people in inadequate housing, in a neighborhood that produced factory workers and blues musicians, who produced, among other things, one of the most successful crossover artists in the history of American popular music. The crossover that made him famous was not a business decision executed from a position of commercial comfort. It was the natural expression of a person who had grown up between categories, who had absorbed country and blues and gospel and jazz before anyone had explained that these were supposed to be separate things, and who performed in the mode that felt most true to what he had absorbed rather than the mode that the industry had expected. Houston's Fifth Ward did not know in 1938 what it was producing. It rarely does. The neighborhood that built him was the same one that gave him everything his music would eventually need: the warmth, the directness, the ability to speak to people from entirely different worlds as if he had always understood their language. He had. He had learned it before he knew he was learning it, in a house too small for 10 people, on a street in Houston that nobody was watching.